Chapter 121 The Ancient Enemy. The morning sun broke over the waters of Blackwater Bay, casting long, pale beams of light through the high, narrow windows of the Great Hall. The Red Keep had been stripped of the dragon skulls years ago, leaving the massive cavern of stone austere and imposing. Banners of the crowned stag hung from the high pillars, but the sheer size of the room was meant to dwarf the men standing within it. Today, however, the Great Hall felt suffocatingly small. Every Lord Paramount, every Warden, and every High Lord of consequence in the Seven Kingdoms stood upon the polished stone floor. They had laid aside their traveling cloaks and donned the heavy, intricate doublets and formal armor of their respective houses. The wealth and martial power of the realm was concentrated in a single room, creating an atmosphere of dense, simmering tension. The air itself highlighted the deep divide. The southern lords smelled of sweet rosewater, spiced wine, and expensive oils, attempting to mask the sweat of their long journeys. In stark contrast, Eddard Stark and the few Northmen in the room smelled of wet wool, oiled leather, and cold iron. It was a physical reminder that two entirely different worlds had been forced into one hall. Tywin Lannister stood near the front of the gathering, his posture rigid, his pale green eyes sweeping the room with cold calculation. Beside him stood his brother, Kevan, and his eldest son, Jaime, who wore the crimson and gold of Casterly Rock rather than the white of the Kingsguard. A few paces away, conspicuously positioned near the very back of the hall, stood the Tyrell delegation. Following Olenna Tyrell's strict, pragmatic instructions, they had secured the ground closest to the exit. Lord Mace Tyrell stood surrounded by his sons, looking deeply annoyed as he whispered complaints to his bannerman, Lord Randall Tarley, who simply stared forward with a face like forged iron. Olenna herself sat in a padded chair, perfectly still. Prince Oberyn Martell leaned casually against a heavy stone pillar, his arms crossed over a doublet of burnt orange silk. He watched the Lannisters and the Tyrells with a faint, mocking smile, thoroughly enjoying the palpable discomfort of the men who had been dragged hundreds of leagues from their comfortable keeps. Lord Hoster Tully, looking frail but dignified, had been provided a heavy wooden chair near the front, with his brother Brynden standing vigilant at his shoulder. Lord Yohn Royce stood tall representing the Vale, while dozens of lesser lords milled about, exchanging quiet, tense murmurs. Near the edge of the gathered nobility, standing apart with deliberate isolation, was the Ironborn delegation. Lord Balon Greyjoy stood like a jagged piece of driftwood carved into the shape of a man, hard, weathered, and utterly unbending. His dark cloak, trimmed with sea salt fur, hung heavy on his shoulders, still carrying the faint scent of brine and ship tar. His pale eyes watched the hall not with awe, but with thinly veiled contempt. At his side stood his daughter, Asha Greyjoy, dressed in fitted leathers rather than courtly silks. One hand rested casually on the pommel of her axe, her stance relaxed, her sharp gaze moving across the gathered lords with open curiosity and faint amusement. Where the southern lords saw a court, she saw a cage full of preening animals. A perimeter of gold cloaks lined the walls, standing at attention, though their presence felt entirely inadequate given the staggering amount of power gathered in the center of the hall. At the far end of the cavernous room, elevated upon the high iron dais, sat King Robert Baratheon. Robert did not slouch. He sat squarely upon the iron throne, the jagged, unforgiving blades framing his massive shoulders. He wore a tunic of heavy black wool embroidered with gold thread, a simple golden crown resting upon his brow. He looked fit, hard, and undeniably dangerous, every inch the warrior king who had smashed a dynasty with a warhammer. Standing beside the base of the throne was Jon Arryn, the hand of the king, looking weary but resolute. Lord Varys and Peter Baelish stood in the shadows near the tapestries, watching the board with silent, unblinking focus. Queen Cersei sat in the royal gallery above, her emerald eyes fixed coldly on the floor below. Beside her lounged Crown Prince Joffrey, draped in rich crimson velvet. The boy wore a visible, haughty sneer, loudly whispering mocking jests to his king's guard about the grim, unadorned Northmen, looking entirely bored by the proceedings. Standing alone in the center of the vast, open space before the Iron Throne was Eddard Stark. Ned wore the plain, dark gray boiled leather of his house, a heavy direwolf pelt draped over his shoulders. He carried no sword, having left ice with his guardsmen at the doors, but he did not look defenseless. He stood with the grounded, immovable certainty of an ancient oak tree. The murmurs and whispers among the gathered lords slowly died down as the heavy oak doors at the rear of the hall were pulled shut with a resounding, echoing boom. The heavy iron bolts slid into place with a loud clack. The doors were locked. The Grand Council had begun. Olenna Tyrell's sharp eyes darted to the secured hinges. Despite her careful precautions to sit near the exit, the Queen of Thorns realized with cold clarity that the wolf had successfully trapped them all in the room. King Robert rested his heavy, scarred hands on the iron armrests of the throne. He looked out over the sea of proud, angry, and expectant faces. Then he shifted his gaze down to his oldest friend. "Well, Ned?" Robert's voice boomed through the great hall, deep and carrying the unmistakable weight of royal authority. "You told me to call them, and here they are. Every great lord from the Arbor to the twins stands before you." Robert leaned forward slightly, the jagged swords of the throne scraping against his heavy wool tunic. "Now, what is it that is so important you wanted all of us here in a single room?" Ned Stark did not bow. He did not offer courtly pleasantries or thank the lords for their travel. He took a slow, measured breath, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second to ensure every ear in the hall was entirely focused on him. He took 3 steps forward, stopping squarely in the center of the floor. "I look upon this hall, and I see the strength of the South," Ned began. His voice was not a shout, but it carried a cold, dense resonance that reached the very back of the room effortlessly. "I see men who measure power in gold, in heavy horse, and in the height of their castle walls. I see men who argue over trade routes, tolls, and the ancient grudges of your fathers." Mace Tyrell scoffed quietly, folding his arms. Ned ignored him. For thousands of years, the South has looked upon the North as a frozen, empty wasteland. Ned continued, his gray eyes sweeping over the gathered nobility. "You thought of the Wall as a convenient place to send your thieves, your poachers, and your disgraced knights. You forgot why the Wall was built in the first place." Ned paced slowly, his boots striking the stone floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. "My ancestor, Brandon the Builder, raised a wall of solid ice," Ned stated, his voice hardening into cold iron. "It is 700 feet tall. It stretches for 300 leagues across the continent, from the Bay of Seals to the Sunset Sea. The foundation is laid with the magic of the first men and the children of the forest." Ned stopped pacing. He looked directly into the eyes of Lord Randyll Tarly, then shifted his gaze to Tywin Lannister. "I ask you, as men with martial minds," Ned challenged them, "do you build a structure that defies all sense simply to keep out starving men wearing animal skins? Do you forge an order of sworn brothers, demanding they surrender their lands, their families, and their lives, just to stop wildlings from stealing a few sheep?" A tense, uncomfortable silence hung in the air. The blunt truth of the question was difficult to ignore. The Night's Watch was not founded to fight wildlings. Ned answered his own question, his voice dropping to a low, solemn register. They were founded to be the shield that guards the realms of men, to hold the line against the dark. Over the centuries, the true purpose was forgotten. The long night became a fable, a children's story told by wet nurses to frighten boys into staying near the hearth fire. Ned turned his gaze back to King Robert. "The North did not forget," Ned said softly. He took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to shatter the reality of every man in the room. "The ancient enemy has returned." For 3 heartbeats, the great hall was absolutely silent. Then the dam broke. "Is this a jest?" Lord Mace Tyrell blustered, his face flushing a deep, indignant red. He stepped forward from his retinue, throwing a hand in the air. "We rode for moons, we suffered the dust of the King's Road. For a nursery tale? You dragged the entire realm to the capital to warn us of grumpkins and snarks. It is an insult," Lord Mal Lister grumbled from the Riverland delegation, his thick brow furrowing. "Lord Stark, we are seasoned men. We do not fear shadows in the snow." Randyll Tarly crossed his arms, his face a mask of martial disdain. "If the wildlings are giving you trouble, Stark, then put them to the sword. Do not try to mask a border skirmish with fables of ancient monsters. A sword cuts flesh, whether it wears a bear pelt or not." Asha Greyjoy let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, just loud enough for her father to hear. "If half of them had seen a real winter," she muttered, "they wouldn't be laughing." Balon did not smile. His gaze remained fixed on Ned Stark. "Starks do not frighten easily," he said quietly. "If he speaks of ghosts, then something has stirred the North." Through the rising chorus of disdain, Prince Oberyn Martell remained leaning against his stone pillar, his arms crossed. A lesser lord from the Stormlands chuckled, turning to the Red Viper to share a mocking jest about northern ghosts. Oberyn simply ignored the man, his dark eyes fixed intently on Ned Stark. Oberyn respected lethal efficiency, and the man who had dismantled the mountain was demanding to be heard. He did not mock, he listened. From the front row, Tywin Lannister did not raise his voice, but his cold, precise tone cut effortlessly through the rising murmurs of the hall. "It is an incredibly convenient fable, Lord Stark," Tywin stated, his pale green eyes narrowing. "You open trade with the wildling savages. You arm tens of thousands of invaders with glass and steel, bypassing the laws of the Iron Throne. And now you claim you are preparing to fight ghosts. It is a mummer's farce, designed to excuse your ambition to build a northern empire entirely independent of King's Landing." "Hear, hear!" a lesser lord of the Westerlands shouted in agreement. The murmurs grew into a chorus of scoffing and outright anger. The southern lords felt deeply insulted. They felt they had been made fools of, dragged away from their comfortable keeps to listen to a madman try to justify his alliance with savages. Ned did not react. He did not flush with anger, nor did he attempt to shout over them. He stood perfectly still, his face carved from granite, weathering the storm of their ignorance. Beside the Iron Throne, Jon Arryn felt a cold, sinking dread settle in his chest. The hand of the king had fostered Eddard Stark. He knew the man better than anyone save the king. Jon looked at Ned's grim, weathered face and realized with absolute certainty that the Lord of Winterfell would rather cut out his own tongue than stand before the realm and lie. Jon Arryn's visible, dawning horror should have served as a warning to the smarter lords in the room, but they were too busy shouting. On the Iron Throne, Robert Baratheon's face darkened with fury. He saw the condescension in the eyes of the southern lords. He saw Tywin Lannister looking at his best friend as if Ned were a deceitful merchant. Robert stood up. "Quite!" The roar of the demon of the trident hit the great hall like a physical blow. The shouting died instantly. Mace Tyrell snapped his mouth shut and took a hasty step back. Tywin Lannister remained still, but his eyes shifted to the king. "You will show some respect," Robert growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that warned of impending violence. "The man standing before you did not hide in a castle when the realm bled. He marched into this very city to protect people and secure my throne." Robert descended the first few steps of the iron dais, closing the distance between himself and Ned. The king's blue eyes were deadly serious. "I have known Eddard Stark since we were boys in the Eyrie," Robert told the silent hall, his voice firm and unwavering. "He is someone I trust with my life in the Seven Kingdoms. He does not play political games. He does not lie to cover his ambitions. And he certainly does not ride 1,000 miles to stand before his king and tell children's stories." Robert stopped at the base of the throne. He looked directly into Ned's gray eyes, the bond of their brotherhood evident in the absolute trust the king displayed. "If Ned says the ancient enemy has returned," Robert declared, "then something is moving in the dark." Robert stepped closer to his friend, lowering his voice slightly, though it still carried to the front rows. "But they are right about one thing, Ned. It is a heavy claim. I know you would not summon the realm, and you would not ask me to lock these doors, unless you brought more than just words." Robert searched Ned's face. "Do you have proof?" Ned held the king's gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a single, solemn nod. "I do," Ned said quietly. Ned turned away from the throne and faced the heavy oak doors at the far end of the great hall. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the pair of gold cloaks standing near the entrance. The guards scrambled to pull the heavy iron bolts. They heaved the massive oak doors open. Marching through the doorway were 8 men of the Wolf Guard. They wore their heavy gray cloaks and thick boiled leather, their faces entirely pale and drawn tight with grim tension. At their head walked the great Jon, his massive battle-axe resting on his shoulder, his usual boisterous grin completely absent. Between the guards, resting on a heavy, iron-wheeled cart, was a massive ironwood box. Transporting the creature from the wall had been an absolute, grueling burden. The box was bound in thick steel chains, wrapped tightly over the wood. The steel links were completely covered in a thick, white layer of hoarfrost that steamed slightly in the warmer air of the hall. The smell reached the Ironborn before the cart did. Asha's nose wrinkled slightly. "That's not rot," she murmured. Not the kind I've smelled at sea. Balan's fingers tightened slightly at his side. No, he agreed, his voice low. It's colder than that. The silence in the room was absolute as the wolf guard pushed the heavy cart down the center aisle. The iron wheels squeaked and groaned against the polished stone floor. As they passed the Lords of the Reach and the Westerlands, men instinctively stepped back. A foul, freezing stench rolled off the box. A smell of ancient, wet earth, spoiled meat, and old ice. They brought the cart to a halt directly in the center of the open floor, exactly between Eddard Stark and the front rows of the gathered nobility. The Great John stepped forward. He did not look at the lords. He looked at Ned, giving a single rigid nod. "Open it," Ned commanded. The lords of Westeros leaned forward slightly, their skepticism warring with an instinctive, creeping dread. Tywin Lannister narrowed his eyes, searching for the trick. Oberyn Martell stopped leaning against his pillar, his dark eyes fixed intensely on the frosted chains. Up in the gallery, Prince Joffrey leaned over the railing, a mocking smirk still plastered on his youthful face. Two of the wolf guards stepped up to the box. They drew heavy iron keys from their belts and unlocked the thick padlocks holding the outer chains together, letting them fall to the stone. They drew back the heavy iron bolts on the front panel of the crate. Meanwhile, other wolf guards moved to the rear of the cart, taking firm, two-handed grips on a separate, thick tether chain that fed through a narrow slot in the ironwood back. They immediately stepped back, drawing their castle-forged longswords. The Great John stepped up to the side of the box. He raised his massive, iron-shod boot and kicked the unbolted wood panel as hard as he could. The heavy iron hinges groaned and gave way. The front panel of the box crashed heavily onto the stone floor. For 2 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence. Nothing moved within the dark interior of the crate. "A box of frozen dirt," Randall Tarley muttered aloud, a sneer forming on his face. "This is a mum." A horrific, screeching sound shattered the silence. The sound of dead cartilage and frozen bones scraping against wood. It erupted from the box with terrifying, explosive speed. It wore the shredded, rotting remains of a wildling for cloak. Its flesh was a gaunt, terrifying ruin, pulled tight and gray over bone. It did not breathe. It had no blood in its veins. But it moved faster than any living man had a right to move. The wight threw itself out of the ironwood crate, its boots slipping wildly on the polished marble, crashed to the floor, instantly scrambling onto all fours like a rabid hound. His head snapped up. Staring out from the ruined, frostbitten face were 2 eyes burning with an unnatural, piercing blue light. They held no humanity, no soul, and no fear. They radiated a singular, fathomless malice. The creature's jaw unhinged, letting out a dry, rattling hiss that sounded like wind blowing through a dead tree. It locked its burning blue eyes onto the nearest living thing, a terrified knight of House Crakehall standing in the front row of the Lannister delegation. The wight lunged. It scrambled across the stone floor with horrifying, frantic speed, its shattered, black-nailed fingers reaching out to tear the knight's throat out. "Gods!" the Crakehall knight shrieked, stumbling backward, his polished boots slipping on the marble as he frantically tried to draw his sword. The wight leaped through the air, its jaw snapping open. It was inches away from the knight's face when the heavy steel chain bolted to its waist abruptly snapped taut. The creature was violently yanked backward in midair, slamming into the stone floor with a sickening, bony crunch. The Great John and 4 wolf guards were leaning back with all their weight, digging their heels into the floor as they gripped the thick iron tether chains anchored to the heavy cart, restraining the monster like a rabid bear on a leash. The wight did not stop. It ignored the crushing impact that would have broken a living man's spine. It immediately began thrashing against the chains with unnatural, relentless force. The heavy iron links bit straight through its gray flesh, scraping harshly against the bone beneath, but the creature felt no pain. It simply clawed at the stone, desperate to reach the living men, its blue eyes burning. Absolute chaos erupted. The dignified, haughty silence of the great hall broke into blind terror. "7 hells!" Mace Tyrell screamed, turning and shoving his own sons out of the way as he scrambled wildly backward toward the walls. Swords rang out across the hall as hundreds of panicked lords drew their steel. Men tripped over each other, shouting curses and prayers in the same breath. The gold cloaks along the walls drew their spears, but they shrank back against the tapestries, their faces pale with horror, entirely unwilling to step toward the thrashing corpse. "Kill it! Kill the abomination!" Lord Royce roared, his sword trembling in his hands. Tywin Lannister had taken 3 swift steps backward, his face drained of all color, his legendary composure breaking at the sight of the dead man fighting the chains. Jaime Lannister stood in front of his father, his golden sword drawn, his eyes wide with shock. In the royal gallery, Crown Prince Joffrey's arrogant sneer shattered completely. The boy let out a high, piercing shriek, dropping his golden wine goblet to clatter loudly against the stone. Stripped of his royal pride, Joffrey scrambled wildly backward, tripping over his own crimson velvet cloak as he desperately tried to hide behind his mother and the white shields of the Kingsguard, weeping in sheer terror. The white hissed again, the sound echoing over the screams of the lords, its broken hands leaving smears of dark, frozen slush on the pristine floor as it fought the Wolfguard's hold. While southern lords stumbled over silks and pride, Asha Greyjoy stepped forward half a pace instead, eyes narrowing as the creature thrashed against its chains. Her hand tightened around her axe, not in fear, but in calculation. Drowned God, she breathed, not in prayer, but in disbelief. That thing's dead. Balon said, his voice grim as iron. For once, there was no arrogance in it, only cold recognition. And it fights like it has nothing left to lose. His gaze shifted briefly to Ned Stark. That is not a war we understand. King Robert Baratheon stared down from the high dais, his blue eyes wide, his massive chest heaving as the reality of the nightmare burned itself into his mind. Robert grabbed the heavy armrests of the Iron Throne and hauled himself to his feet. He took a deep breath, filling his massive lungs, and unleashed a roar that shook the very foundations of the Red Keep. Silence. Chapter 122. The Shattered Realm. Silence. King Robert's roar slammed into the great hall like a physical blow. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the Baratheon king echoed off the high stone vaults, cutting through the blind terror of the gathered lords. The panic scramble toward the walls ceased. Men froze, their drawn swords trembling in their hands, their breath catching in their throats. Only the wet, horrific sound of the dead man thrashing against its heavy iron chains broke the sudden stillness. The creature paid no mind to the king's command. It continued to claw wildly at the polished marble, its glowing blue eyes fixed on the living meat it so desperately wanted to tear apart. Near the fringes of the gathering, the Ironborn did not scramble like the rest. Balon Greyjoy stood rigid, his weathered face carved from salt and stone, his pale eyes locked onto the thrashing corpse. He did not recoil. He did not speak, but the fingers of his good hand curled slowly, tightening as if gripping an invisible railing against a rising storm. Beside him, Asha Greyjoy leaned forward instead of back, her sharp gaze drinking in every unnatural movement. "That's no man," she muttered under her breath, "and no storm I've ever sailed through." Meanwhile, Robert stood before the Iron Throne, his massive chest heaving. He stared down at the squirming corpse, his blue eyes wide, the blood roaring in his ears. For 15 years, he had ruled a realm of whispers, poison, and coin. Now, a nightmare from the Age of Heroes was dragging itself across his floor. The king slowly dragged his gaze away from the monster and looked at the man who had brought it. Eddard Stark stood perfectly still, his gray eyes calm and unyielding. Robert gave a single, grim nod. Ned took the cue. He stepped forward, putting himself between the thrashing white and the terrified lords of the south. "You look upon it, but your minds refuse to accept it." Ned's voice carried through the cavernous hall, steady and hard as forged iron. "Your priests tell you the dead sleep beneath the earth. Your maesters tell you the long night is a fable born of a long winter. They are wrong." Ned pointed down at the struggling corpse. "This is a white," the Warden of the North declared. "A dead man, raised from the snow by the white shadows that hunt in the deep woods beyond the wall. It does not breathe. It does not eat, feels no pain, and it knows no fear. If you cut its throat, it will not bleed, and it will not stop." Lord Yohn Royce gripped his sword with white knuckles, his face pale. "It is a trick of the flesh. A man driven mad by a foul poison or a mummer's potion. Flesh yields to steel, Stark. It always has." "Does it?" Ned challenged. Ned turned his gaze to the steps of the high dais, where the legendary Lord Commander of the Kingsguard stood. "Ser Barristan," Ned called out. Ser Barristan Selmy stepped forward, his white cloak flowing behind him. The old knight's face was lined with deep, unsettling dread, but his duty overrode his fear. "You are universally recognized as the finest blade in the Seven Kingdoms," Ned said to the knight. No man in this hall can claim you are part of a northern deception. I ask you to draw your sword, Ser Barristan. Come down here, and cleave this creature in two. Barristan did not hesitate. He drew his castle-forged long sword, the steel singing clearly in the silent hall. He descended the steps, his pale blue eyes fixed on the thrashing corpse. He approached the creature carefully, measuring the distance, gripping his hilt with both hands. The white snapped its broken jaw at the approaching knight, its blue eyes burning with malice. Barristan stepped into range. With the flawless grace that had made him a legend, the old knight swung his blade in a heavy horizontal arc. The heavy steel sheared cleanly through the white's midsection. The dry, frozen spine snapped with a loud, sickening crack. The creature was cut entirely in half at the waist. The heavy tether chain that had been holding it back suddenly went slack, slipping uselessly from the severed spine. A collective gasp of pure horror rippled through the great hall. Free of the chain, the severed upper torso of the white hit the floor and immediately reached out with its shattered, black-nailed hands. Dragging its trailing, bloodless entrails across the polished marble, the top half of the corpse crawled relentlessly toward Ser Barristan, its jaw snapping wildly. A few feet away, the severed legs and pelvis twitched, thrashing blindly against the heavy iron hobbles that still bound its ankles, kicking at the air with unnatural vigor. Ser Barristan stared at his bloodless sword, his composure deeply shaken. He took another step back, staring at the crawling torso. "Gods preserve us," the old knight whispered. As you can see, Ned Stark's voice cut through the rising panic. Normal steel is entirely useless. You cannot bleed it. You cannot break its heart. If you face a horde of these creatures with ordinary iron, you will exhaust your arms hacking them to pieces, and the pieces will simply crawl up your legs and bite through your throats. Ned walked toward the crawling torso. He drew a sharp, pitch-black dagger from his belt. "There are only 3 ways to kill them," Ned instructed the silent, terrified room. "The first is fire. Flame consumes the magic that binds them. The second is Valyrian steel." Ned stopped just out of reach of the snapping, severed jaw. "And the third," Ned raised the black dagger, "is the weapon of the first men, dragonglass." With a swift, brutal motion, Ned stepped forward and drove the obsidian blade squarely into the back of the crawling torso. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature did not scream, but a loud, hissing sigh escaped its parted lips, the sound of rotting ice cracking under pressure. The luminescent, piercing blue light in its eyes suddenly flickered, dimmed, and extinguished entirely. The upper torso collapsed flat against the stone, instantly becoming nothing more than a pile of ordinary, rotting dead flesh. But the severed legs a few feet away continued to thrash in their hobbles. The Great John did not wait for an order. The giant lord of the last hearth calmly drew a black dragonglass dagger from his belt. He walked over to the kicking legs and drove the black glass deep into the frozen thigh. The legs instantly went limp, dropping heavily to the marble as the magic within them died. The casual, almost bored efficiency with which the giant handled the monster deeply unnerved the southern lords, showing them exactly how far behind they truly were. The oppressive, freezing aura that had radiated from the box vanished, leaving only the foul smell of a common corpse. Ned pulled the dragonglass dagger free and wiped it on the dead man's furs. The silence was profound. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of an entire kingdom's understanding of the world shattering in an instant, until Grand Maester Pycelle rattled his heavy chains from the gallery. "It is a trick," the old man stammered, his voice reedy with sheer, desperate denial. "Alchemy, a Myrish illusion of wires and foul poisons. Dead men do not." "Shut your mouth, Pycelle," King Robert growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that cut through the hall like a blade. "Say one more word, and I will have your tongue ripped out so you can never speak another." Pycelle snapped his mouth shut, shrinking back into his heavy robes, trembling as the king's absolute fury silenced any further denial. Ser Barristan Selmy sheathed his useless castle-forged sword. He did not return to his post by the Iron Throne. Instead, the legendary knight looked at Eddard Stark with humble respect. "How do we train men to fight an enemy that does not bleed, Lord Stark?" Barristan asked quietly. The simple question officially shifted the military authority of the room from the south to the north. Ned looked around the hall. Along the walls, the gold cloaks had lowered their spears. Their hands were shaking violently, the iron tips of their weapons rattling against the stone floor. They did not weep, but their wide, terrified eyes spoke of absolute panic. If the seasoned city watch was this broken looking at one chained corpse, a southern army would shatter and rout in the open field. Near the front of the hall, Tywin Lannister stood perfectly rigid. His pale green eyes were fixed unblinking on the rotting meat on the floor. For his entire life, the Lord of Casterly Rock had built his power on a single, unwavering foundation. Men could be controlled. Men desired gold, they feared death, and they bled when pierced by a spear. Tywin had crushed the reins of Castamere because they were proud. He tried to sack King's Landing because the Mad King was vulnerable. But this broke every law of power he understood. Tywin weighed the harsh reality of what he had just witnessed. How do you negotiate with an enemy that feels no fear? You could not. Tywin realized, with a cold, sinking dread in his stomach, that all the wealth in the Westerlands was entirely useless against this threat. His mind raced back over the last 10 years. He thought of Eddard Stark's strange behavior, building glass houses, paving roads to move grain faster, exporting tens of thousands of brittle glass instead of iron. Tywin had thought the Wolf was building an independent empire to challenge the Iron Throne. He was not building an empire, Tywin realized, the sheer magnitude of his own miscalculation striking him. He was rationing for a siege. He was preparing for the end of the world. Tywin Lannister, the most feared man in Westeros, realized he was entirely unequipped for the only war that mattered. Beside him, Jaime Lannister stared at the golden hilt of his own sword. Jaime had always defined his worth by his skill with a blade. He could read a man's shoulders, anticipate a strike, and parry a thrust with instinctual grace. He was the greatest swordsman alive because he understood how living bodies moved and reacted to pain. But watching Barristan Selmy cleave an enemy in two, only to see that enemy continue crawling forward to bite him, broke Jaime's confidence. Skill meant absolutely nothing against the dead. A master swordsman parries to open a vulnerability. But if the enemy will gladly let you run them through the chest just so they can step forward and tear your throat out with their teeth, all the swordplay in the world was useless. If you did not possess fire or dragonglass, you were just meat waiting to be butchered. Jaime looked up at Ned Stark, the respect he held for the Wolf deepening into something far more profound. Stark was not just a warden. He was the shield holding back the dark. Balon Greyjoy's thoughts ran along a different current. Gold meant little on the Iron Islands. Fear meant even less. Strength was everything. But what strength was there against an enemy that could not be cowed, could not be broken, and could not even be killed by a blade? The Old Way had no answer for this, and that truth sat heavier in his chest than any chain. Standing near the base of the dais, Stannis Baratheon felt no panic, nor did he mourn the petty politics of the capital. Stannis was a man defined by rigid law and duty. He looked at the dead thing on the floor and felt a grim, unyielding clarity. The true duty of a king and a lord was to protect the realm of the living. He immediately resolved that whatever the North needed to fight this war, it was his legal and moral obligation to provide it. In the back of the hall, Olenna Tyrell sat in her padded chair, her wrinkled hands gripping the armrests tightly. The scent of her expensive rosewater suddenly smelled foul, tainted by the stench of the rotting corpse. She thought of her son, Mace, blustering about grain tolls and trade routes. She thought of her own careful plotting to keep Highgarden wealthy and secure. It was all so incredibly, pathetically petty. What good was the wealth of the Reach if a tide of unfeeling corpses marched over their fields? What good were their heavy nights if their horses refused to charge the walking dead? Olenna was a survivor. She saw the board clearly. The games of the South were over. If the North fell, the rest of the continent would follow in a matter of moons. She immediately resolved that Highgarden must change its course. They would not fight the North. They would send grain. They would send wagons. They would secure dragonglass at any cost. Leaning against his stone pillar, Prince Oberyn Martell did not look terrified. His dark eyes were wide, but a strange, grim thrill coursed through his veins. Looking at the rotting horror on the floor, his desire for southern revenge suddenly felt incredibly small. Poisons relied on a beating heart. A spear relied on a man feeling the pain of a pierced lung. This was a monster of ancient, fathomless magic. The world was so much older, darker, and more terrible than the squabbles of lions and stags. A grim, dangerous smile touched the corners of Oberyn's mouth. Eddard Stark was a man worth fighting beside. In the shadows near the tapestries, Lord Varys stood completely paralyzed. The spider was a master of whispers. His entire grand design, grooming young Aegon, funding the Golden Company, guiding the Dothraki horde to cross the sea, relied on a predictable human Westeros. He had planned to let the great houses bleed each other dry so his perfect prince could arrive as a savior. But if the long night was returning, the board was completely destroyed. Varys realized with a cold, suffocating dread that he had been meticulously arranging pieces on a Syvas board that was currently resting inside a burning house. His secrets could not stop the winter. His little birds could not spy on the dead. A few feet away from the spider, Petyr Baelish felt his entire grand design collapsing. Chaos is a ladder. He thrived in confusion, using men's greed to climb higher and higher. He had stolen millions of golden dragons from the Iron Throne, hiding them in a damp cellar, waiting to buy his way to ultimate power. But looking at the dead flesh on the marble floor, Petyr's genius completely failed him. How do you bribe a corpse? How do you blackmail a shadow? What good was a hidden vault of gold when the enemy did not desire coin, did not require food, and could not be reasoned with? Petyr's vast, stolen fortune was suddenly nothing more than a pile of heavy, useless rocks. He had spent his life playing a game against other men, entirely blind to the fact that the board itself was about to be swallowed by the dark. For the first time in his life, the master of coin felt entirely, helplessly small. Up in the royal gallery, Queen Cersei Lannister gripped the railing so tightly, her nails dug into her own palms. Beside her, Crown Prince Joffrey had completely shattered. The boy who had spent the morning sneering at the grim Northmen was now curled into a pathetic ball on the stone floor, weeping uncontrollably. He had scrambled backwards so frantically that he had torn his velvet cloak, attempting to physically hide behind the white shields of the Kingsguard. The stench of urine drifted from him, proving the Crown Prince had soiled himself in pure, blind terror when the severed torso had crawled across the floor. Cersei looked down at her golden son with a sharp, undeniable flash of disgust, but the disgust was quickly drowned out by her own primal, suffocating fear. For years, Cersei had believed she was the cleverest player in the capital. She had surrounded herself with Lannister guards and believed that the Iron Throne offered absolute safety. But looking at the rotting meat on the floor below, her entire foundation crumbled. A Lannister army could not slay a myth. Her beauty could not manipulate the cold. Her gold could not buy the loyalty of the dead. She looked down at Eddard Stark, standing calm and resolute among the panic. She hated him. She hated the Warden of the North more fiercely in that moment than she ever had before. She hated him for bringing this nightmare into her safe, golden world, and she hated him for proving that all her ruthless southern scheming meant absolutely nothing in the face of the true dark. Standing near the base of the Iron Throne, Jon Arryn felt the crushing weight of his own failures bearing down on his old shoulders. The hand of the king had spent the last 15 years managing grain taxes and border disputes. He had thought he was holding the realm together. But looking at the rotting creature on the floor, Jon realized he had been sweeping the porch while the house was burning down. He felt an overwhelming wave of shame for doubting his former ward, and an even deeper wave of gratitude that the North was held by a man of absolute, unyielding honor. On the high dais, King Robert Baratheon did not look terrified. He did not look ashamed, and he did not look calculating. Since Greyjoy Rebellion, Robert had been drowning in boredom. He hated the endless council meetings, the whispered lies, and the delicate, tedious maneuvering required to rule a kingdom at peace. The Northern Games did satisfy his urge for entertainment, but it was not a war. Looking down at the slain monster on his floor, the heavy, suffocating fog of his boredom completely vanished. The warrior woke. This was an enemy of pure, ancient evil. It was a foe that could not be reasoned with, could not surrender, and could not be shown mercy. Robert looked at his massive warhammer resting against the side of the Iron Throne. His blood began to run hot. He finally had a true purpose again. Ned Stark held the black dragonglass loosely in his hand, looking up at the silent, breathless lords of the Seven Kingdoms. For 8,000 years, the wall has stood. Ned's voice rang out, breaking the heavy silence. But the Night's Watch needs our help. If the dead march on the wall in force, it will fall. Ned turned, his gray eyes sweeping over the pale faces of the Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Martells, and the Tullys. The games you play in this city mean nothing, Ned declared, the absolute truth of his words echoing off the high stone vaults. Your gold will not save you. Your titles will not shield you. If the North falls, the dead will march south. They will add your armies to theirs, and they will extinguish the light of this world permanently. Ned Stark looked directly at King Robert. "Now you know," the Warden of the North said softly, though every man in the room heard him. "The true war is in the north, and the winter is coming." King Robert stepped down from the iron dais. He walked past the severed, rotting flesh of the white, completely ignoring the stunned lords, and firmly took the black dragonglass dagger from Ned's hand. Robert turned and held the pitch-black blade high into the air for the entire realm to see. "The Game of Thrones is over," Robert boomed, his warrior's blood running hot, his voice echoing like thunder off the stone walls. "Any man who bleeds his neighbor instead of preparing for the dark will answer to my hammer." Chapter 123. The King and the Wolf. King Robert's voice echoed like a thunderclap off the high stone vaults of the great hall, bringing the blind panic of the southern lords to a grinding halt. He stood at the base of the iron throne, the black dragonglass dagger raised high in his fist. For a long, breathless moment, no man dared to speak. The lords of the Seven Kingdoms stared at their king, realizing that the bored monarch had been entirely replaced by the hardened warrior who had once shattered a dynasty. Robert slowly lowered the black glass. He looked over the pale, terrified faces of the men who ruled his kingdom. He saw Tywin Lannister's rigid jaw. He saw Mace Tyrell wiping sweat from his brow. He saw Jon Arryn looking older and more burdened than ever before. "The realm has slept for 15 years, Robert declared, his voice dropping from a roar to a heavy, dangerous rumble. "We have grown soft arguing over coppers and pride. But the dark is waking, and I will not have my kingdom divided when the dead come marching." Robert turned his gaze to the wardens and the lords paramount. "Return to your quarters. Wash the stench of fear from yourselves," the king commanded bluntly. "Tonight, after the sun sets, the small council will convene in my private solar. I want the wardens, the lords paramount, or their chosen representatives present and small council members. The rest of you will remain in this keep until I dismiss you." Tywin Lannister gave a single, stiff nod. Lord Hoster Tully, leaning heavily on his brother Brynden, bowed his head. Prince Oberyn Martell offered a sharp, acknowledging salute. "Lord Stark," Robert said, turning to Ned, "secure that foul thing. I don't want it stinking up my hall any longer than necessary." "It will be done, your grace," Ned replied evenly. He signaled the Great Jon. The massive lord of the last hearth didn't hesitate. With the casual efficiency of a man tossing a sack of grain, the Great Jon grabbed the heavy tether chain, hauled the severed legs back into the ironwood box, and unceremoniously kicked the upper torso in right behind them. The wolf guards slammed the heavy panel shut, dropping the heavy iron bolts into place. The spell was broken. The lords of Westeros began to file out of the great hall, their arrogant swagger completely shattered, moving with the hurried, anxious steps of men who had just looked over the edge of the world. Hours later, the sun dipped below the walls of King's Landing, plunging the capital into the long shadows of the evening. Deep within the royal rooms, the king's private solar was a haven of thick stone, heavy tapestries, and roaring hearths. The air was warm, smelling of roasted meats and old wood. King Robert Baratheon sat in a massive leather-backed chair near the fire. He had stripped off his formal black velvet doublet, wearing only a plain linen tunic that strained across his broad, heavily muscled chest. Across from him sat Eddard Stark, dressed in his dark gray boiled leather, the direwolf pelt resting on the back of his chair. Between them, on a low, sturdy oak table, sat a crystal decanter of dark, northern plum brandy. It was not a formal meeting of state. For the first time since the courtyard arrival, the king and the warden were not wearing their titles. They were simply two old friends, veterans of a brutal war, sharing a drink in the quiet before the storm. Robert poured 2 heavy measures of the dark brandy. He slid one iron cup across the wood to Ned and took a long, steady drink from his own. The king let out a heavy sigh, staring into the roaring flames of the hearth. The heavy tension of the great hall had settled into a quiet weariness. 15 years, Ned, Robert murmured, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. For 15 years, I sat on that cursed chair of swords, listening to men whisper lies into my ear. I listened to them argue over shipping routes, border tolls, and who had the right to collect taxes on a stretch of dirt in the Riverlands. It felt like I was suffocating. Robert took another slow sip of the strong brandy. I always had a feeling a great war was coming, Robert admitted, his voice quiet and honest. I could feel it in my bones. You don't forge a kingdom in blood and expect it to survive in peace forever. I thought it would be the Targaryen boy across the water. I thought Viserys would find an army, or the Greyjoys would rise again, or Tywin Lannister would finally decide he was tired of taking orders. Robert looked up, meeting Ned's calm gray eyes. I expected men, Ned. I expected a rebellion of steel and flesh, Robert said, shaking his head slowly. I never in my wildest dreams expected the horror stories my wet nurse told me to come crawling out of an ironwood box. The truth of the world is often darker than we wish it to be, Robert, Ned replied softly, holding his cup but not drinking. The first men did not carve their warnings in stone to entertain children. Robert leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The king looked at his friend with a mixture of grim respect and awe. You planned for this? Robert stated, not as a question, but as a hard fact. You didn't just sit in the snow and wait. You rebuilt Moat Cailin. You paved your roads. You built glass houses so your people wouldn't starve when the fields froze. You forged an entire kingdom into a fortress. Robert let out a short, disbelieving laugh. I thought you were just being a stubborn, pragmatic northern bastard trying to outdo the wealth of the South. But you were bracing for a siege. You built the anvil. If the North falls, Robert, the rest of the continent follows, Ned said simply. I did what was required of my blood. Robert nodded slowly, accepting the stark truth of the statement. But the sharp mind of the battlefield commander, the mind that had won the trident, was turning over the scale of Ned's preparation. But how did you know, Ned? Robert asked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. The dead haven't marched yet. Yet you have been preparing for a decade. Robert pointed a thick finger at the Warden of the North. For 10 years, you have been buying shipments of dragonglass from the Dragonstone. Shiploads of black rock. I thought you were using it for jewelry or building materials. But you were forging spearheads. How did you know to buy the glass before you ever saw a corpse walk? Ned sat perfectly still. He met the king's searching gaze without blinking. He could not speak of the void, the entity that had placed his soul into this body, or the foreknowledge he possessed. The men of Westeros would simply assume he had gone mad. Instead, Ned offered a lie. But he grounded the lie in the ancient, unyielding traditions of the North, forging a pragmatic cover story that perfectly fit the character of Eddard Stark. It is a teaching passed down from my father, Robert, Ned said, his voice solemn and steady. And his father before him. Every son of Winterfell is given a warning when he comes of age. The words of our house are not just a boast about the weather. Winter is coming is a prophecy. We were told that the ancient enemy was only sleeping, and that one day, the dark would return. Robert listened intently, taking another sip of his brandy. In a world where Targaryens used to ride dragons and the wall stood 700 feet high, a generational warning passed down by the Kings of Winter was entirely plausible. My father told my brother, Brandon, and to me, Ned continued quietly. When the Mad King burned them both, the warning fell to me. I did not know when the long night would return. I only knew that I was the Warden of the North, and it was my duty to watch the deep woods. Robert's expression softened, the old grief of the rebellion shadowing his heavy features. He raised his iron cup. To Rickard and Brandon, Robert murmured, his voice thick with solemn respect. The Mad King's cruelty cost us dearly, but perhaps the gods knew what they were doing, Ned. They put the one man who would actually prepare for the winter into the seat of Winterfell. Drink. Ned raised his cup, and they drank to the ghosts of the past. Robert lowered his cup, his eyes hardening back to the pragmatic present. My royal castellans have been sitting on a mountain of that black rock, complaining about the damp for a decade. Keep your men digging, Ned. Hollow the cursed island out if you have to. I will order the garrison to double their efforts. Ned leaned forward, setting his iron cup on the table. I intend to. When I took the reins of Winterfell after the rebellion, I began paying close attention to the ranging reports from the Night's Watch. There were signs near the Gift. We saw frequent, aggressive wildling raids. They were raiding for food, and they were abandoning their settlements in the haunted forest. They weren't just moving south. They were fleeing. Animals flee a forest fire before you ever see the smoke, Robert murmured, understanding the logic instantly. Exactly, Ned confirmed with a firm nod. The wildlings were terrified of something in the deep woods. I could not send an army north of the wall to investigate without provoking a war with the free folk. So I made a choice. Better to be safe than sorry. I began buying the dragonglass. I began building the glass houses. I decided to prepare the north for the worst possible outcome, praying that I was wrong. Ned looked down at his hands. I was not wrong. Robert let out a long, slow breath, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. He stared at Ned, seeing the immense, crushing burden his friend had carried in silence for 15 years. While Robert had been drinking and hosting tourneys, Ned had been silently shouldering the survival of the entire human race. Gods, Ned, Robert whispered, shaking his head. I should have known. I should have paid more attention to the wall. You were stabilizing a broken kingdom, Robert, Ned replied pragmatically. We each had our duty, but now the truth is laid bare. The dead are real, and they are gathering. Robert finished his brandy, setting the empty cup down with a heavy, decisive clack. The weariness left his eyes, replaced entirely by the hard, unyielding light of a king preparing for war. So, what now? Robert asked, crossing his massive arms over his chest. I have summoned the lords to this room, just as you asked. You showed them the monster. They are terrified. But you and I both know the men of the South. Robert scowled, his lip curling in disgust. I warned them to stop their Game of Thrones today. I told them I would smash any man who bleeds his neighbor. But they are vipers, Ned. The fear will only hold them for so long. My own wife will whisper in the shadows, trying to secure her family's power. They will try to use this war to their advantage. Robert slapped his palm against the heavy oak table, the frustration of his reign bubbling over. And how am I supposed to command Tywin to march his men into the snow when the crown owes Casterly Rock 1,000,000 dragons? The moment I give the order, the old lion will demand his gold. He holds the purse strings, Ned. We cannot fight a war of this scale if the crown is crippled by debt. Ned took a slow sip of his brandy, his gray eyes remaining perfectly calm. Do not worry about the crown's debts tonight, Robert, Ned said smoothly. Tywin Lannister's gold will not be an obstacle for much longer. Robert narrowed his eyes, sensing the hidden weight in his friend's words, but he didn't press. Ned stood up from his chair. He walked around the low oak table, stopping directly in front of the king. He looked down at the man who had fought a war for his sister. Robert, do you believe me? Ned asked softly. Robert looked up. There was no hesitation in the king's eyes. The political rot of King's Landing had poisoned many things, but it had never touched the bond forged between them in the Eyrie and tempered in the blood of the Trident. With my life, Ned, Robert answered, his voice absolute and unwavering. Ned gave a single, slow nod. When we enter that meeting room tonight, Ned instructed, his gray eyes sharp with unyielding conviction. Whatever I say, you must go with it. Do not object. Do not question my authority in front of the lords, and do not stop me from doing what must be done. Robert studied his friend's face. He saw no ambition there. He saw no desire for the Iron Throne, no hunger for gold or titles. He saw only the brutal, terrifying necessity of a commander preparing his lines for the ultimate siege. The king did not ask for details. He did not demand a summary of Ned's plans. Robert Baratheon simply stood up from his chair. He rested his heavy hand on the warden's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. The room is yours, Ned, Robert promised grimly. If they step out of line, I will break them myself. Ned Stark nodded. He picked up his heavy direwolf pelt from the back of the chair and slung it over his shoulders, fastening the iron clasp tight against his collarbone. Good, Ned said quietly. He turned toward the heavy oak doors that led to the council chambers. The lords of Westeros were waiting on the other side, armed with their ledgers, their plots, and their endless, exhausting greed. Some men build walls, Robert, while others thrive only by digging beneath them, Ned murmured, his hand resting on the iron latch of the door. A realm preparing for a siege cannot afford to have rats whispering in the foundations. Before we face the long night, we must sweep the dark corners of your own house. Ned pushed the heavy door open. Let us remove a few pieces from the board, Ned said. Chapter 124. The Rulers of the Ashes. The heavy oak doors of the great hall had been thrown wide open to let the sea breeze scour the room, but the foul, metallic stench of ancient rot seemed to cling to the very stones of the Red Keep. That same invisible stench followed the great lords of the South as they retreated to their private chambers. The illusion of their invincibility had been violently stripped away, leaving behind a cold, undeniable dread. In the opulent, crimson-draped solar commandeered by House Lannister, the silence was suffocating. Tywin Lannister stood before the roaring hearth. He did not look at the flames. He stared at the smooth stone of the mantel, his posture so rigid he might have been carved from marble. The Lord of Casterly Rock had built an entire dynasty on the certainty that gold, steel, and cunning could conquer any obstacle. He had just watched a severed torso crawl across the floor to bite the greatest knight in the Seven Kingdoms. Behind Tywin, the room was tense. Jaime Lannister sat heavily in a high-backed chair, staring blankly at his own hands, his mind replaying the sheer uselessness of his sword against the dead flesh. Kevan Lannister paced quietly near the windows. Tyrion sat near a side table, rapidly drinking from a goblet of strong whiskey, trying to wash the taste of the graveyard from his mouth. Queen Cersei paced the length of the Myrish carpet, her emerald eyes wide and frantic. "It is a trick," Cersei hissed, her voice trembling with an uncharacteristic, ragged edge. "It has to be a trick. Lord Stark brought a mummer's beast from the deep snows to frighten us. A disease of the blood. An Essosi poison." "It was a dead man, Cersei," Jaime said softly, not looking up from his hands. "It had no blood. Barristan cut its spine in half, and it did not care." "I do not care what it was," Cersei snapped, rounding on her brother. "I care that the savage wolf brought it into the very room where my children stood. He unleashed a monster at the foot of the Iron Throne. Robert should have his head for treason, not invite him to drink in his solar." Tywin Lannister turned slowly from the hearth. His pale green eyes locked onto his daughter. There was no fear in the Lord of the Rock, only a cold, towering fury that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. "The Warden of the North brought a threat to the attention of the realm," Tywin stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "And how did the Crown Prince respond to this threat?" Cersei faltered, her frantic pacing coming to an abrupt halt. "Joffrey is a boy." He was startled. "Startled," Tywin repeated, the word dripping with venomous disgust. "He wept like a whipped dog." He scrambled backward on his hands and knees and soiled his own breeches. Tyrion took a long sip of his wine. "To be fair, father, I believe half the Tyrell delegation also soiled themselves. But Joffrey did show a remarkable talent for hiding behind the white cloaks of men sworn to protect him." "Shut your mouth, dwarf," Cersei snarled. "Tyrion is right," Tywin cut in, stepping toward his daughter. "Your son made a complete mockery of House Lannister and the Iron Throne. The lords watched the heir to the Seven Kingdoms weep in his own filth. Do you think Eddard Stark's sons wept when they first saw that creature? He is only 10 and 4 Namesday DLD. Cersei defended fiercely, her maternal pride warring with her fear of her father. It was a demon from the freezing hells. No child could be expected to stand firm against such a horror. "A king does not weep before his enemies," Tywin commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "A king does not cower. You have spent all these years filling the boy's head with arrogance and velvet, Cersei, and you have raised a sniveling coward. When the time comes for him to rule, the lords of this realm will remember the day the Crown Prince wet himself while the wolves held the line." Cersei flushed a deep, ugly red, her fists clenched at her sides, but she did not dare argue further. "Forget the boy's trousers," Jaime murmured, finally looking up from his hands. His green eyes were sober and deadly serious. "Father, if what Stark says is true, if there is an army of those things in the deep woods—" "I heard the wolf," Tywin interrupted smoothly, his mind already shifting from his grandson's humiliation to the grim necessity of survival. "Swords are useless. We require fire, and we require the black glass." Tywin looked at Kevan. "Send ravens to Casterly Rock and Lannisport immediately. Order the harbor masters to seize any merchant vessel carrying pitch, oil, or obsidian. We will not be caught unarmed. If the North demands a monopoly on survival, we will build our own." Kevan nodded quickly. "At once, brother." "And what of Robert?" Cersei asked bitterly. "He drinks with his northern friend and treats us like errant children." "Let the king drink," Tywin said coldly, turning back to the hearth. "When the dead finally come, a warhammer will not save him. House Lannister will ensure its own survival." Down in the vast, cobblestone courtyard of the Red Keep, there was no debating the reality of the threat. There was only the grim, silent work of the North. The Great John walked ahead of a dozen Wolfguard soldiers. They carried the heavy, frost-covered ironwood box between them, hauling it out of the great hall and down the wide stone steps. They did not struggle or complain. They moved with unbroken discipline. Around the perimeter of the courtyard, the servants, grooms, and gold cloaks watched them with wide, terrified eyes. The small folk whispered frantically, shrinking back against the walls to avoid the foul, metallic stench leaking from the timber. The Northmen ignored the whispers. They carried the box to a secluded, stone-paved corner of the outer yard. Heavy bundles of dry pine and thick barrels of pitch had already been gathered. They stacked the wood high, hoisted the chained crate onto the center of the pyre, and drenched the timber in oil. The Great John took a burning torch from a wall sconce and tossed it onto the pile. The flames roared upward, consuming the ironwood and the nightmare trapped within. The Northmen stood in a perfect, silent circle around the fire, their faces unreadable masks of stone, waiting until there was absolutely nothing left but gray ash and blackened iron. They left no remnants for the South to fear or worship. In the lavish, silk-draped pavilion commandeered by House Tyrell, the scent of fear had entirely overpowered the scent of roses. Lord Mace Tyrell paced frantically, his face pale and slick with sweat. His youngest son, Loras, sat on a padded bench, staring at the floor. The Knight of Flowers, usually so eager for glory and tournaments, looked physically ill, the memory of the snapping jaw and blue eyes having stripped the romance of knighthood from his mind entirely. Garland Tyrell stood near the window, his hand resting steadily on his sword hilt, a grim but resolute expression on his face. "It is the end of days," Mace blustered, wringing his hands. "The wall will fall, and the dead will march on Highgarden. We have no walls of ice. We have no dragon glass." "Oh, stop wailing. Mace, you sound like a wounded pig," Olenna Tyrell snapped. The Queen of Thorns sat at the head of a heavy oak table. She did not look panicked. She looked sharply annoyed. Beside her sat her granddaughter, Marjorie, who watched the old woman with quiet, intense observation, learning how true power operated in a crisis. Mace stopped pacing. "Mother, did you not see that abomination? Our knights will be slaughtered." "I saw it perfectly well," Olenna said, reaching across the table and physically snatching a quill from the inkwell. She pulled a piece of blank parchment toward her. "Which is why we are not going to fight them with knights, you absolute fool. We are going to fight them with our silos and our granaries." Olenna began to write with rapid, vicious strokes. "I am sending a raven to Willis immediately. We are stopping all production of luxury wines, perfumes, and decorative flowers. Every field from the Mander to the Dornish marches is to be planted with wheat and root vegetables." She looked up, her sharp eyes pinning her son. "The Reach is the breadbasket of Westeros. If the North is going to hold the line, they will need food. The Lannisters have gold, but you cannot eat gold in a blizzard. We will empty our coffers to buy every ounce of salt and smoked meat from across the narrow sea. By the time the winter truly sets in, the entire survival of the realm will depend on our stores." Marjorie smiled faintly, pouring a cup of water and setting it near her grandmother's hand. "And if we hold the food, grandmother, we hold the power." "Exactly, my sweet," Olenna said, signing her name with a sharp flourish. "Let Eddard Stark freeze his toes off fighting the ghosts. We will secure our legacy by feeding the survivors." 2 levels down in the Red Keep, the austere chambers of the Master of Ships were devoid of such grand scheming. There was only duty. Stannis Baratheon stood near a heavy writing desk, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheek twitched with a rhythmic, grinding sound. Sitting in a simple wooden chair near the small hearth was his wife, Catelyn Baratheon. The Lady of Storm's End looked incredibly pale. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of a small, carved wooden 7-pointed star. She was praying silently, pleading with the mother for mercy and the warrior for courage. She had grown up in the Riverlands, surrounded by the warmth of the sun. The idea of dead men walking in the snow was a violation of everything the faith had taught her. "Prayers will not stop them, Catelyn," Stannis said, his voice blunt and devoid of comfort. The creature in the hall did not care for the gods, cared only for flesh. Catelyn looked up, her blue eyes wide with lingering terror. "It goes against the natural order, Stannis. How can the Father allow such an abomination to walk the earth?" "I do not know the mind of the gods," Stannis replied, his face a mask of rigid duty. "I only know the truth of my own eyes." Eddard Stark did not lie. The threat is real, and the realm is completely unprepared. Stannis walked to his desk. "I must write to Steffan," he declared. Catelyn's breath caught. Steffan was 10 and 6 Namesday old, left to act as the Lord of Storm's End while they remained in the capital. It had only been 3 moons since they had seen him, but suddenly, the formidable walls of the Stormlands felt entirely inadequate. "You will tell him of the dead?" Caitlin asked, her voice trembling. "He is the acting Lord of Storm's End," Stannis corrected firmly. "It is his duty to know the truth of the world. I will command him to empty the treasury if he must. He will fill the granaries of Storm's End until the doors cannot close." Caitlin closed her eyes. "And Shireen?" she asked softly. Stannis's hand stopped moving. His daughter was safe in her chambers down the hall, blissfully unaware of the horror. Stannis loved her with a fierce, quiet intensity that he buried beneath a mountain of duty. He would burn the world to ash before he let a dead man touch her. "Did she hear the shouting from the throne room?" Stannis asked, his voice noticeably quieter. "No," Caitlin answered. "She knows nothing." "Keep it that way," Stannis commanded softly. "When the time comes to fight, I will do my duty. But until then, we will shield her from the fear." Stannis left Caitlin to her prayers, stepping out of his chambers into the dim stone corridor to deliver the Raven Scroll to the Rookery himself. He had barely taken 10 steps when he heard the frantic, hyperventilating breaths. Renly Baratheon was pacing violently in an alcove near the stairs. The Master of Laws had entirely lost the charming, arrogant smirk he wore like armor. His green velvet doublet was wrinkled, and he was wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "A ship?" Renly was muttering to himself, his eyes wide and frantic. "I have gold. Loras and I can hire a swift galley. We can sail to Lys, or Volantis. The dead cannot cross the narrow sea. They have no ships." Stannis stopped. A wave of acidic disgust washed over him. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbing his younger brother roughly by the shoulder and shoving him hard against the stone wall. "You are a Baratheon," Stannis hissed, his voice a low, grinding growl that promised violence. "You are a member of the King's Council. You will not pack your silks and flee across the water like a frightened merchant." Renly swallowed hard, staring at his brother's unyielding face. "Stannis, did you not see it? Swords do not work. They will slaughter us. They will slaughter you if you turn your back," Stannis corrected harshly, giving Renly a firm shake. "The realm faces a true war, Renly. Not a tourney, not a feast. If the North falls, there is no free city far enough to hide you. So stand up, stop your pathetic whimpering, and grow a spine. We have work to do." Stannis released him, leaving Renly pinned against the wall, pale and silent, as the Master of Ships continued his march to the Rookery. In another wing of the Red Keep, the Lord of the Iron Islands stared out a narrow window toward Blackwater Bay. Balon Greyjoy had aged significantly since the day Eddard Stark took Euron's head and forced Balon to bend the knee. His hair was gray, his face deeply lined with salt and bitterness. Beside him stood his daughter, Asha. She wore practical leather and sea-stained wool. Unlike her father, she did not look bitter. She looked deeply unsettled. She was a warrior, but the speed of the creature on the floor had defied all martial logic. "It was fast, father," Asha murmured, crossing her arms. "Faster than a living man. If they swarm the walls." "Let them swarm," Balon said, a hard, cruel smile cracking his weathered face. Asha looked at him, surprised by his lack of fear. "You are not concerned." "Why should I be?" Balon asked, turning away from the window. "The wolves of the north broke our fleet. The stags of the south took our pride. Let the dead march on them. Let the white shadows bleed the green lands dry." Balon walked to the small table, picking up a rusted iron dagger. "Eddard Stark is arrogant. He believes he can hold the line. He will throw every Northman he has into the snow to fight this war, and the lions and the roses will exhaust themselves trying to help him. But dead men do not sail, Asha. They have no gills." Asha frowned. "You intend to hide on the islands?" "I intend to wait," Balon corrected, his dark eyes gleaming with the ruthless opportunism of the Ironborn. "When the long night is over, the lords of Westeros will be decimated. Their castles will be empty, their numbers thinned to nothing. That is when the Iron Fleet will strike. We will reave their coasts and take back everything we lost, and there will be no wolves left to stop us." Across the Red Keep, in a luxurious suite smelling of incense, Prince Oberyn Martell lay on a wide featherbed. Beside him, Ilaria Sand traced a slow, lazy circle on his bare chest. They had sought the comfort of their bedchambers immediately following the assembly, choosing to burn away the cold dread in the sheer, vibrant heat of the living. Will Doran believe you? Ilaria asked softly. When you tell him the ancient enemy has awakened? Oberyn let out a low, amused breath. Doran is never uninformed. He should be already informed of what happened in the throne room with the help of his spies. And your revenge? Ilaria murmured. Will you put aside your hatred for the rock to fight the snow? Oberyn stared at the ceiling. He thought of the rotting corpse on the marble floor. The petty squabbles over the Iron Throne suddenly felt incredibly small. I will fight the dead when the dead arrive, Oberyn whispered. But until the snow falls, I intend to watch the old lion squirm. Tywin Lannister has just realized his gold cannot buy survival. I am going to enjoy watching him realize he is no longer the most dangerous predator in the realm. While the lords processed the horrifying reality of their new world, the men who truly thrived in the shadows remained isolated in their own chambers, rapidly recalculating the board. In his modest apartments, Peter Baelish sat behind his desk. He did not tremble. His earlier breakdown in the Great Hall had passed, replaced by the cold, logical turning of his own ambition. You cannot bribe a corpse, Peter thought, staring at his ledger. But you can certainly profit off the men fighting them. If the North demanded massive shipments of dragonglass and food to survive, the demand for supply lines would skyrocket. The great lords would march their armies north. They would need coin to buy winter gear, wagons, and oil. Peter would not fight. He would stay in the warm halls of the Red Keep. While the kings and the wardens threw their treasuries into the meat grinder of the long night, the crown would inevitably need to borrow more gold. Peter would use his hidden vault of stolen dragons to quietly fund the war effort through merchants, ensuring that when the living finally defeated the dead, the Iron Throne and the great houses would be crippled by debt, a debt owed entirely to him. Deep in the windowless depths beneath the Red Keep, Lord Varys sat on a simple wooden stool in the dark. The spider's grand design had suffered a staggering blow. The North must hold the line, Varys deduced, the cold logic settling into place. Varys realized he had to ensure the Iron Throne committed its full strength to stopping the dead. Aegon would not sail now. He would remain in Essos, safely hidden behind the Golden Company. Varys would let Robert Baratheon swing his hammer in the dark. He would let Tywin Lannister's knights shatter against the unyielding cold. When the true threat was eliminated and the lords of Westeros were too weak to hold their own swords, Aegon would cross the narrow sea. He would arrive with untouched troops and grain, claiming his rightful throne over the exhausted, bleeding survivors. Varys smiled in the dark. To the men who lived in the shadows, the long night was merely a terrible storm to weather before claiming the ruins. The sun finally set over King's Landing, casting the Red Keep in deep shadows. In the grand, heavily guarded meeting room designated for the King's Council, the tension was palpable. The braziers burned brightly, illuminating the massive, polished oak table. One by one, the most powerful men and women in Westeros took their seats. They did not speak. The shared, horrifying truth of the morning had stripped away their usual pleasantries and veiled insults. Tywin Lannister sat near the center, his face a mask of cold stone. Beside him sat his eldest son, Jaime Lannister, his eyes entirely sober. Opposite them sat Mace Tyrell, still looking faintly ill, and his mother, Olenna Tyrell, whose sharp gaze missed nothing in the room. Prince Oberyn Martell slouched casually in his chair, though his dark eyes tracked every movement with the lethal precision of a desert viper. Stannis Baratheon sat rigidly, the very picture of unyielding duty, while Renly sat beside him, looking pale and thoroughly chastened after his encounter in the corridor. Lord Hoster Tully sat heavily, coughing softly into a linen cloth, with his brother Brynden the Blackfish sitting beside him, his veteran eyes assessing the defensive capabilities of the men around the table. Lord Yohn Royce represented the Vale, his thick arms crossed over his bronze-runed armor. Grand Maester Pycelle sat near the foot of the table, silent and trembling. Beside him sat Lord Varys and Peter Baelish. The spider kept his hands hidden in his silk sleeves, while the Master of Coin maintained a tight, polite smile. Near the end of the table sat Balon Greyjoy, his face sour and bitter, alongside his daughter Asha, who watched the mainland lords with quiet intensity. The room was full, but the true seats of power remained empty. At the very head of the table sat the king's massive, high-backed chair. To its immediate right sat Jon Arryn, the hand of the king, looking incredibly burdened. To the king's immediate left, a sturdy oak chair remained vacant. The lords waited in silence. Finally, the great doors swung open, and the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Robert Baratheon walked in first, the way he always did, like he owned every stone beneath his boots, like the room had been built specifically to contain him. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, and his blue eyes swept the table with the blunt, unimpressed gaze of a man who had stared down armies and found them wanting. But it was not the king that made the lords shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was the man walking beside him. Eddard Stark kept pace with Robert without effort, without ceremony, without any of the careful, measured deference that the other lords performed like a second skin. He did not walk behind the king. He did not walk ahead. He walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, stride for stride, the way men walk when the years between them have burned away every pretense and left only something raw and unbreakable underneath. The lords of the south watched them cross the length of the chamber and understood, perhaps for the first time, what they were truly looking at. Not a king and his subject. Not a liege lord and his bannerman. Two men who had grown up side by side in the cold halls of the Eyrie, who had been boys together before the world demanded they become something harder, who had laughed and trained and argued and chosen each other so many times over so many years that the bond between them had long since stopped being a choice and simply become a fact, as permanent and unremarkable to them as breathing. Petyr Baelish looked at them and felt something cold move through his chest that he refused to name. Varys watched them from beneath his lashes and quietly revised 3 separate plans. Tywin Lannister stared at the space between them, that easy, unguarded inch of air that spoke of absolute trust, and recognized it for what it was. The only kind of power in the world that could not be bought, could not be manufactured, and could not be used against them. These two men had not come to negotiate. They had not come to perform the careful dance of politics that most of the lords around this table had spent their entire lives mastering. They had come to prepare a realm for the longest, darkest night in living memory. And if the realm refused, if the lords at this table chose gold over grain, pride over steel, and politics over survival, then they would not be asked twice. Robert marched to the head of the table and sat down in his high-backed chair. Robert looked out over the standing lords of his kingdom. He gave a short, commanding wave of his hand. Sit. The scrape of heavy wooden chairs echoed through the room as the most powerful figures in Westeros retook their seats in absolute silence. Eddard Stark did not take the vacant seat to the king's left. The Warden of the North remained standing tall beside Robert, casting a long, unyielding shadow over the polished oak. Chapter 125. The Cost of the Game. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the Kingsguard, sealing the council chambers. Every man and woman seated around the massive table turned their gaze toward Eddard Stark. The Warden of the North had not taken his seat. He remained standing, casting a long, unyielding shadow over the polished wood. He did not look like a man who had just won a miraculous victory. He looked entirely calm, his gray eyes sweeping over the gathered power of the realm with cold, unyielding focus. They watched him, their minds racing, trying to guess what the quiet wolf would do next. Ned broke the stillness. He stepped slowly away from the king's left, walking along the edge of the massive oak table. The table was generously laden with all manner of refreshments for the gathered lords and multitude of heavy glass goblets catching the firelight so the council could drink. Resting near the center of the table was a heavy crystal decanter filled with a pure, clear liquid, Northern Fire, a potent, biting vodka brought directly from the Winterfell distilleries. Ned reached out and took one of the thick, heavy-bottomed glass goblets from the table. He unstoppered the decanter and poured himself a decent measure of the clear spirit. The sound of the liquid splashing into the glass was exceptionally loud in the breathless room. Ned raised the goblet, taking a slow, measured sip. The high-proof vodka burned a smooth, fiery trail down his throat. He lowered the glass and began to walk. His boots made a slow, deliberate, rhythmic thud against the stone floor as he began to circle the massive oak table. He moved behind the seated lords, his presence a heavy, physical weight at their backs. We all know that there is a game played in this realm. Ned's voice broke the silence, resonating with a quiet, dense authority that commanded absolute attention. A great Game of Thrones. It spans the 7 kingdoms, but King's Landing is the center of it. The beating heart of the board. Ned walked slowly past the rigid posture of Stannis Baratheon, his gray eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the hearth. Everyone in the 7 kingdoms is a part of this great game, Ned continued, his tone conversational, entirely devoid of the booming bluster of southern lords. They play the game as the players, moving the pieces across the map. Or, they become pawns in the hands of those players, bled and sacrificed for a profit of players. Ned took another slow sip of his drink, his footsteps carrying him past his old mentor, Jon Arryn. The hand of the king watched him with a mixture of pride and deep, lingering sorrow. Some men might choose not to be a part of it, Ned murmured, the cold edge of his voice sharpening. They try to stay in their keeps, to tend to their own lands and ignore the whispers. But the players of the game use that isolation to their advantage. They drag honest men into the dirt, even if they have no desire to play. Ned paused for a fraction of a second. The memory of a suffocating throne room, wildfire, and a madman's laughter flashed through his mind. My father Rickard Stark tried to play the game, Ned said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, ancient grief. But he was not successful. He should have stayed in the north. He should never have set foot in the south. But I was not old enough to caution him at the time. Ned resumed his pacing, the grief vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the calculating gaze of a veteran commander. Some of the greatest players of the game are currently present in this room, Ned observed. As he walked past the Westerlands and reached delegations, his cold gray eyes deliberately fell upon Tywin Lannister, and then shifted smoothly to Olenna Tyrell. Tywin's face remained a mask of flawless stone, betraying absolutely nothing, while the Queen of Thorns offered a faint, acknowledging tilt of her head. They knew what they were, and they knew the wolf saw them clearly. And some of you, Ned continued, his gaze drifting across the table to the far end, tried to make a move and got absolutely destroyed for your efforts. Ned looked directly at Balon Greyjoy. The Lord of the Iron Islands stiffened, his lined face contorting into a scowl of bitter resentment at the reminder of his crushed rebellion. Asha Greyjoy placed a subtle, restraining hand on her father's forearm, her eyes fixed warily on the pacing warden. The king declared that the Game of Thrones is finished, Ned said, his boots carrying him around the foot of the table, past Grand Maester Pycelle and Lord Varys. The spider sat perfectly still, his hands hidden in his silk sleeves, his dark eyes tracking Ned's every step with mounting, primal unease. But none of us are naive enough to believe the game is over just like that, Ned stated softly. For the true players of the great game, the revelation of the long night does not end the board. It simply means a new player has entered the game in the form of the dead. Ned took another sip of the clear vodka. The room hung on his every word. No one dared to interrupt. No one asked what Eddard Stark was getting at. They were entirely captivated, waiting to see where the conversation led. Most of you are currently thinking about how to defeat this new player, Ned noted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. You are formulating strategies against the great enemy. You are calculating grain, dragonglass, and siege lines. Ned continued his slow, deliberate pacing around the table. Thousands of years ago, kings and high lords surrendered their lands and took the black because they understood the cost of survival, Ned stated, his voice carrying the weight of ancient history. The Night's Watch did not care about a man's name or his wealth. The cold strips away all titles. It is time the realm learned that same humility. He looked at the faces of the great lords. There are no longer separate houses in this realm. There are no lions or roses or falcons. There is only the living, and anyone who intentionally weakens the living to serve their own petty ambition is an enemy of the dawn. Ned's gaze drifted to the Master of Coin. Some men believe their vaults make them untouchable. But the dead do not take bribes. You cannot buy a mercenary to fight the cold, and a golden dragon does not hold a sharp edge. When the long night falls, your ledgers will only be good for kindling. He stopped pacing for a brief moment, letting the words sink in. For 15 years, the North has stayed behind its borders. We let you play your games. We watched you lie, extort, and betray one another for a jagged iron chair. But we will no longer tolerate men who dig beneath our walls while we stand guard upon them. Ned's gray eyes flashed with a cold, unyielding anger. 28,000 men slaughtered in the mud of the Neck few moons ago. They were farmers and cobblers fed on lies by men who sat in warm rooms, drinking wine and moving pieces on board. You spill the blood of the innocent because you have forgotten what it means to bleed yourselves. He resumed his slow walk, stepping behind the king's chair. The rules of your game are dead. Treason is no longer just plotting to steal a crown or poisoning a cup. From this day forward, treason is hoarding food while men freeze. Treason is blinding the realm to the true dark to line your own pockets. And the penalty for it will be exacted immediately. Ned stopped pacing entirely. He stood between Lord Yohn Royce and the Master of Coin, Peter Baelish. When a northern keep prepares for a harsh winter, Ned murmured, his tone dropping to a lethal, icy pitch. The Castellan's first duty is not to sharpen the swords. It is to take a torch down into the dark cellars and root out the rats. Because a rat will eat the grain you need to survive the snow, and it will do it from the shadows. Baelish sat leaning slightly forward in his chair, seemingly relaxed. His elbows rested on the table, and the fingers of his left hand were casually, rhythmically drumming against the polished oak wood. Tap, tap, tap. A portrait of polite, unbothered attention. Ned looked down at the master of coin. You sit here perfectly calm, Ned said softly, drumming your fingers on the king's table. You look at the end of the world, and you do not feel fear. You only wonder how you can weigh the ashes and sell them for a profit. Ned drained the last of the vodka from his goblet. Then, with a swift, practiced motion, Ned inverted the heavy glass goblet in his hand. With sudden, terrifying speed, Ned rammed the inverted glass downward with devastating force. He brought the hard, circular rim of the goblet directly down onto Baelish's drumming fingers, pinning them against the unyielding oak table. Driven by the weight of Ned's strike, the hard rim of the glass acted like a sudden, brutal blade. It sheared cleanly through flesh and bone before the goblet shattered instantly against the hard oak beneath it. A sickening, wet crunch echoed through the silent chamber. For one agonizing second, Petyr Baelish did not process what had happened. His gray-green eyes blinked, staring blankly ahead. His brain simply could not comprehend the sudden, absolute violence that had erupted from nowhere. Then the sensation reached his mind. Two of his fingers had been cleanly severed, the separated fingers lying uselessly amidst the shattered glass and spilled drops of vodka. Baelish let out a high, ragged shriek. The room exploded. Every Lord Paramount and High Lord in the chamber vaulted out of their chairs in absolute shock. Jon Arryn gasped, knocking his chair backward. Hoster Tully staggered up, supported by the Blackfish. Mace Tyrell let out a startled yell, stumbling away from the table, while Stannis Baratheon stood rigidly, his jaw tight. Gods above! Yohn Royce bellowed, stepping away from the spraying blood. Only 4 people remained seated. Tywin Lannister did not move a muscle. His pale green eyes locked onto Ned Stark, his mind instantly reading the brutal shift in the room's dynamic. Olenna Tyrell remained perfectly still, her sharp eyes taking in the bloodshed with morbid fascination. Prince Oberyn Martell leaned back in his chair, a dark, genuinely delighted smile spreading across his face as he watched the master of coin scream. And King Robert Baratheon sat firmly on the Iron Throne's proxy chair, his massive hands resting on the table. What is the meaning of this? Mace Tyrell shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Ned. You attack a member of the King's Council? Ned looked past the screaming, bleeding man beneath him. He looked directly at Robert. Robert Baratheon's blue eyes were hard as forged steel. He didn't ask questions. He slammed his heavy fist onto the table, the sound resembling a thunderclap. Sit down and shut up, Robert roared, his voice physically shaking the dust from the tapestries. The absolute authority of the demon of the trident slammed into the panicked lords. Reluctantly, trembling with shock, the standing lords slowly lowered themselves back into their seats. The only sound left in the room was Petyr Baelish, hyperventilating and sobbing as blood pooled rapidly on the polished oak. Ned did not let him pull his ruined hand away. With his free hand, Ned reached down and grabbed a fistful of Baelish's dark hair. He yanked the Master of Coin's head back, forcing Baelish to look up at the ceiling, exposing his throat. Ned looked out over the pale, shocked faces of the people present in the room. You see this man? Ned said, his voice entirely calm, contrasting horrifyingly with the violence of his actions. Here sits the Master of Coin, the man responsible for the gold flowing in and out of the 7 kingdoms. Ned shifted his gaze to the hand of the king. Jon Arryn looked physically sick, staring at the blood of his former protégé. Jon, Ned asked, his tone demanding a swift answer. What is the current debt of the Iron Throne? Jon Arryn swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Robert and Ned. 3 million golden dragons, Lord Stark. Ned gave a slow, cold nod. He looked down at the weeping man in his grip. You see, this rat has put the 7 kingdoms 3 million dragons in debt. Baelish choked on his own breath, tears streaming down his face as the agony radiated up his arm. The mask of the calm, polite courtier was entirely destroyed. It wasn't me. Baelish gasped frantically, his voice a pathetic, reedy whine. The king and queen live a lavish lifestyle. They demand endless feasts, grand tourneys, the grand games. The king asks for spectacles, and I have to produce the coin. I only borrow to pay for his grace's demands. The lords around the table murmured. It was a well-known fact. Robert's spending was legendary, and the crown's debts to Casterly Rock and the Iron Bank were an open secret. Baelish was merely a victim of the king's excess. Ned's expression did not change. He kept his firm grip on Baelish's hair. He placed his other hand flat on the table, directly over the bleeding, ruined stump where Baelish's left hand was pinned, holding the man's arm immovably in place. Ned reached over to the spread of drinks on the table, pulling another thick, empty glass goblet from the selection. He inverted it, exposing the hard rim. He brought the heavy glass down, placing the rim directly over the ring finger of Baelish's trapped left hand. Now tell me, Ned commanded softly, his face mere inches from Baelish's ear. How much of that gold have you stolen from the royal treasury? Varys, sitting a few seats away, felt his blood run entirely cold. The spider's hands trembled within his silk sleeves. He realized, with a terrifying absolute certainty, that the Warden of the North was not guessing. Eddard Stark knew. I don't know what you are asking, Lord Stark. Baelish wept, thrashing uselessly against Ned's iron grip. I have always been loyal to the king. I have never taken a single copper. Ned brought his fist down, driving the inverted glass rim through the bone with brutal, mechanical force. The glass shattered against the table, severing the ring finger completely. Baelish screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony that echoed off the stone vaults. A lie, Ned stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. For every lie you tell, a finger will be removed. Ned looked down at the ruined hand, then at Baelish's right hand, which was gripping the armrest of his chair in white-knuckled terror. You now have 7 fingers remaining, Lord Baelish. After that, I do not know what part of you I will cut next. You can't do this to me. Baelish shrieked frantically, spitting blood and saliva, his eyes wide and manic with panic. He looked desperately toward Jon Arryn, then toward the king. I am a member of the small council. You cannot accuse me of treason without proof. You have no right. Ned reached out, his face an emotionless mask, and took another glass goblet from the table, inverting it in his palm. He placed the rim over Baelish's remaining pinky finger. He smashed it downward. The glass broke. The finger was severed. Baelish convulsed, nearly passing out from the blinding shock of the pain. Only the agonizing grip on his hair kept him upright. Only the thumb remains on this hand, Ned noted clinically. He leaned in closer. I am waiting for an answer, Baelish. How much? I didn't take any gold, my lord. Baelish sobbed, his mind entirely broken by the pain, unable to abandon the lie that had defined his entire adult life. I swear it by the 7. Ned took a final glass goblet, inverted it and placed it over the thumb. He drove it down, cleanly removing the final digit. Baelish let out a low, gurgling moan, his eyes rolling back in his head. All the fingers from his left hand had been removed, leaving only a mangled, bleeding palm pressed against the oak table. He is bleeding out, Ned, Jon Arryn whispered, his voice trembling as he watched the butchery. He will live, Ned replied coldly. Ned released Baelish's hair. He reached down, grabbed the weeping man's uninjured right hand, and slammed it flat onto the center of the table. He pinned the wrist down with his forearm, locking it in place. The lords around the table watched in morbid, paralyzed fascination. Tywin Lannister's green eyes were narrowed, weighing the sheer, staggering implications of what Lord Stark was asking. If the Master of Coin has been stealing the crown's gold, Tywin realized, a cold fury building in his chest, then my loans to the Iron Throne have been siphoned into the pockets of a brothel keeper. Ned looked at the sobbing, broken man. Since you cannot find the words, Ned said quietly, shall I tell the realm the truth of how you magically conjure the gold the king wants, and how you take care of the gold you claim to borrow? Ned did not reach for a glass goblet this time. He reached across the table, taking a heavy, solid bronze wine goblet that belonged to the king's service. He inverted the metal cup, exposing the hard, circular rim. You used the gold stolen from the royal treasury to establish brothels all over the 7 kingdoms, Ned declared, his voice ringing clearly in the silent room. Every major city building a spy network, save for the north, which I made sure of. Ned brought the inverted bronze goblet down with punishing force onto the pinky finger of Baelish's right hand. The metal rim sheared cleanly through the bone, completely severing the digit. Baelish gagged, a fresh wave of agony racking his body. You used the crown's borrowed gold to ensure that most of the merchants and guildmasters in the capital are in your pocket, Ned continued mercilessly, listing the crimes to the shocked council. He brought the bronze rim down again. The ring finger was separated against the oak. You used the gold stolen from the treasury to buy the steel and horses to arm the faith militant against the north, Ned revealed. The reaction in the room was instantaneous. Mace Tyrell gasped, his face turning a deep shade of red. Tywin Lannister's jaw locked so tightly his teeth threatened to crack. The Westerlands and the Reach had believed the Zealots were acting on their own pious foolishness, or funded by religious fanatics. To learn that the Master of Coin had quietly orchestrated the invasion of the North using the Crown's own stolen funds was a revelation of staggering treason. Ned brought the bronze goblet down a third time, severing Baelish's middle finger into a bloody ruin. You currently have 2 million gold dragons stored in the underground room of your primary brothel on the Street of Silk, Ned stated, exposing the ultimate prize. Jon Arryn stared at Ned in absolute disbelief. Robert Baratheon's eyes widened, the sheer scale of the theft finally registering. 2 million dragons. The man weeping on the table had hollowed out the iron throne from the inside. Ned brought the heavy bronze rim down once more, severing the index finger. Baelish had only one functional thumb left in the world. The room has a Myrish puzzle lock on the heavy stone door, Ned said, leaning down so his face was inches from Baelish's weeping, blood-splattered visage. And you personally poisoned the wine of the 2 foreign stonemasons who constructed the underground vault, burying them beneath the very floorboards where you hide your stolen gold. Baelish did not scream. He did not deny the charges. He did not beg for his life. When Baelish heard the exact, impossible details of his crimes committed in absolute solitude, secrets he had never spoken aloud to a single living soul, his mind completely shut down. The sheer, terrifying reality that the Lord of Winterfell could see through stone walls and read the darkest corners of his past broke whatever was left of Petyr Baelish. Whether it was the agony of his mangled hands or the absolute destruction of his life's work, the Master of Coin simply fell entirely, mercifully silent, his eyes staring blankly at the wood. In his chair across the room, Lord Varys felt a cold sweat break out across his powdered brow. The spider realized that if Eddard Stark knew about the dead stonemasons and the Myrish lock, then the Northman likely knew everything. He knew about Illyrio. He knew about Aegon. The Master of Whisperers had spent his life believing he saw all. He now realized he had been dancing blindly in the palm of a wolf. The silence in the small council chamber was deafening. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip of Baelish's blood hitting the stone floor. Ned Stark stood up straight. He tossed the bloody bronze goblet onto the table. It clattered loudly, rolling to a stop near Jon Arryn's hands. Ned looked around the room, meeting the shocked, calculating, and terrified eyes of the most powerful men and women in the 7 kingdoms. A cowardly player of the great game just got exposed, Ned declared, his voice carrying the finality of an executioner's blade. Ned grabbed Baelish by the collar of his ruined silk doublet and shoved him roughly backward. Baelish slumped heavily into his wooden chair, staring blankly ahead, his ruined hands resting uselessly in his lap, bleeding profusely onto the floor. Ned did not release the fabric immediately. His hand shifted, grasping the silver mockingbird pin fastened to Baelish's breast. With a sharp yank, Ned ripped the pin from the silk, tearing the fine cloth. He turned and tossed the silver bird directly into the roaring hearth fire. The metal began to blacken and melt among the hot coals, a physical end to the climbing lord's legacy. At the head of the table, Jon Arryn slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The hand of the king looked gray, the weight of his years and the shame of his own blind spot bearing down heavily upon his shoulders. He looked at the bleeding, broken man he had brought to the capital and elevated to power. "I brought this man to court," Jon Arryn said, his voice thick with regret, looking toward King Robert. "I gave him his ledger, believing him to be a capable, loyal servant of the realm. It is a failure I will carry to my grave, your grace." Jon turned his weary eyes back to Baelish. "Petyr Baelish," the hand of the king declared, his voice firming with the legal authority of the Iron Throne. "For the crimes of high treason, theft from the royal treasury, and funding the enemies of the crown, You are hereby stripped of your seat on the small council. You are stripped of all titles, and your lands in the fingers are forfeit." Ned turned and looked at King Robert. The king did not look angry at the violence. The king looked utterly furious at the betrayal of his master of coin. Ned gave Robert a nod. Robert turned his gaze to the two Kingsguard knights standing near the heavy oak doors. "Take him from this room," Robert commanded, his voice echoing with cold northern justice. "Make sure he does not bleed to death. Then, place him in the deepest, darkest cell of the black cells." Robert looked at Baelish's ruined, weeping form one last time. "Make sure he isn't dead. I want him begging for death." The two Kingsguard knights did not hesitate. They marched forward, grabbing the catatonic master of coin by the arms and dragging him out of his chair. Baelish offered no resistance. As they hauled him across the floor, a low, pathetic whimper of pain finally escaped his lips, a weak plea for mercy that fell on completely deaf ears. They dragged him out of the chamber, leaving a long, smeared trail of blood across the polished stones. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing the small council chambers once more. Ned Stark remained standing at the side of the table. He pulled a clean linen cloth from his pocket, calmly wiping the blood from his hands. He looked out over the pale, silent faces of the Southern lords. "One player removed from the board," Ned said quietly.